you, and welcome. My name is Carmen Rogers. I'm within Career Management, one of the Associate Directors within the School of Hotel Administration. And today I'm here with Sarah Hilsman, who's the Associate Director for Student Immigration within the International Students and Scholars Office here at Cornell University. So Sarah is actually going to be talking with us today about the F-1 Curricular Practical Training, or also known as CPT. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We do have some questions that some of our students have been asking, and so I want to start with probably one of the most obvious questions, which is, what is an F-1 CPT visa?
Good question. So F-1 is the immigration status, as you know, and what we call CPT is Curricular Practical Training. It's not actually a separate visa, it's work authorization or a benefit of F-1 status that allows students to do off-campus work and be paid for work in their field.
Wonderful. So what's the criteria to be eligible for CPT?
So after an F-1 student has been enrolled in an academic program for a full academic year, which is 2 semesters, fall and spring, or spring and summer counts, or summer and fall, they are able to apply for this type of work authorization for off-campus.
Okay. What does it mean to actually have a valid F-1 status?
That's a good question, because no matter what kind of benefit you're applying for in the Immigration Service, you have to have valid visa status of whatever type you're in. So F-1 is a student visa status, and to be valid, you have to have maintained your status through following the regulations, staying enrolled full-time. For undergraduates, that's 12 credit hours in the fall and spring. You don't have to be enrolled in the summer. And then also keeping your documents updated with the international office.
So if I'm a student, do I have to be registered while on CPT?
That's a good question too. What most often students do is use curricular practical training during the summer, and that's a time when you don't have to be registered, and then you can do curricular practical training full-time. There is an opportunity to use curricular practical training during the year in the fall or spring, but at that time you would have to be registered and you would have to use curricular practical training part-time, not full-time.
So then what exactly is part-time status?
That's a good question. So part-time for the Immigration Service is 20 hours or less.
Okay.
Anything over 20 is considered full-time.
Does one have to pay U.S. taxes on their salary?
So whenever an international student is working in the U.S., their income is subject to income tax just the way it is for a citizen or a permanent resident. Some countries have tax treaties with the U.S., and that would exempt students' income from part of the taxes, but probably not all of the taxes.
And then how does an employer know that an individual is tax exempt?
Most employers would not be watching for the tax treaty status. At the international office, we purchase software every year which figures out the tax treaties for students. So what is most likely is that the income would be withheld and the taxes withheld, and then once the students file for their tax returns every year, they would get that money back.
But that's only if a student's been living in the U.S. less than 5 years?
That's correct, absolutely.
So then how would a student know, or how does a student let the employer know that they're tax exempt?
Some employers would ask for the citizenship information and might be able to apply a tax treaty. Most employers don't realize that students are also exempt from Social Security. That's true not just for international students, but also domestic citizens or permanent residents are also exempt from Social Security when they're registered full-time. So because employers don't know that, we do encourage students to tell employers. They may or may not go along with that information, and if you want the international office to explain it to them, we're happy to do that. There's also a way for students to reclaim that money if the employer does withhold it.
How do students apply for an F-1 CPT visa?
So one of the things about CPT is that a student needs to have a job in order to apply for it, because the work authorization is specific to an employer in a specific location. So first, the student has to decide which of the many lovely offers I'm sure they will get that they want to do for the summer. So once they have that job offer, they then get the CPT application, which is available on our website or in our office. There is a form. The student fills out part of it about their own personal information and also information about the job. They then take that form to an academic advisor who would sign off that the internship will be for credit in some way. It either has to be required for a degree program, or the student has to take a course that requires the internship. So that application then comes to us. We actually go into the CVIS federal database and update the student's record, and then we print out a new I-20 immigration document for the student that details that work authorization.
And how long does it take to actually process this type of application?
It takes us literally about 5 or 10 minutes in our office. We like to say to students to apply at least 2 weeks before you start working. You must have the work authorization before you can work. We say apply 2 weeks ahead so that in case there's something missing on the application, the student has time to take care of that.
So, other questions that students have that we're hoping that you could answer. What's an I-20?
The I-20 form is an immigration document that allows students to gain F-1 status. We originally give it to them when they apply and are admitted. Then they take it to a U.S. consulate and get an F-1 visa. So the I-20 is the immigration document that goes along with the F-1 student status.
And what proof of employment authorization does one need to actually give to an employer?
Yeah, so on your first day of work, or sometimes even prior to your first day of work, the employer will ask for certain documents to show both that you are who you say you are and that you have work authorization in the U.S. So after we have authorized curricular practical training, the student would bring their passport, the I-20 that we have updated with the work authorization, and also a form called the I-94 form, which is part of what proves that you have F-1 status in the U.S.
Now, what exactly is an I-94 form?
The I-94 form also is called a U.S. admission record. And so when a student enters the U.S., that is the moment that they actually gain status, according to U.S. immigration law. So the port of entry creates what is called an I-94 record and shows that at that moment when the student entered, they were given F-1 student status. Now that I-94 record is online. It used to be a paper form, and it's online, but the student can go in and get the record and print it out, and that's what they would need to give to their employer, the printout.
If a student has other options for visas, which should they choose?
So when the student applies for work authorization, sometimes employers will ask, do you have work authorization? Do you need work authorization? And they might suggest other types of visas. They might even suggest optional practical training instead of curricular practical training, or the H-1B work visa, which many students may have heard of. They could even suggest an O-1. We would strongly urge students to stick to not only F-1 status, because it's what they're in, but the curricular practical training, because it is much easier to obtain than optional practical training. In terms of the H-1 or the O-1, those would be visas that a student would pursue after graduating. It would not be appropriate or even possible to get those visas for a summer internship.
So that's all the questions that we have today. I'd like to thank Sarah for being here and answering all of these questions with regard to CPT.